As we look at this manufacturing overhead, we've already discussed the variable overhead component. Let's look at the fixed overhead component. And this is kind of a complex thing, or hard to understand why we would even need to look at a variance beyond understanding what I have here, which is how much we actually spent compared to the flexible budgeted amount. And what you can see here is we spent $104,000 more than what we should have spent given a flexible budget. So we'd say that's unfavorable. We spent more than what we wanted to. But I think a larger question is, if these are fixed costs, why do I have a different budgeted amount? Isn't the amount that I produce, a quantity of a product, there's no link or relationship as to fixed costs? It's fixed. It shouldn't change regardless of how many I make. And that's partially true and partially not. It's true that the cost shouldn't change. However, we do know that fixed costs are stepped, right? And that means that the more product we make, the larger the company has to get. We have to hire more supervisors, we have to buy more machines and depreciate them, and those would be considered maybe fixed costs. And so we do apply overhead. If you can think back to earlier chapters, the amount of overhead that we actually record through our accounting system gets applied based on some allocation base, which is what we did with the variable amount, and we're going to do that with the fixed amount too. So that's why we have the two varying budgeted amounts for the fixed overhead. One is for the static budget and one is for the flexible budget, assuming that there's some variation in fixed costs, although that kind of defeats the definition of a fixed cost. So anyways, the whole point here is we know we have an unfavorable variance for fixed factory overhead. And the question we're trying to answer, is there any more information we can get out of this that could be useful in managing the organization so that this doesn't happen again? And the answer is perhaps. So we come up with two different ways to split that variance out. One is what we call a fixed overhead spending variance. And what that does is it simply compares what we actually spent with, I think there's actually a misprint in the book, not the flexible budget amount, but the static budget amount. So the actual costs occurred were the $1,832,200. That's what we actually spent. And the static budget was the $1,800,000. And so when you compare the two, which is what this overhead variance is trying to do, you take the actual cost, which is the 1,832,200, and you subtract that from the static budget, you have a $32,000 difference. And that's saying that we spent more than what we thought we should. Unfavorable. Right? And so that tells us of this $104,200 difference when you compare it to a flexible amount, right, the actual flexible amount, $32,200 is because of spending more. How can you spend more on a fixed cost item? Well, you could again rent new space. The lease costs for your equipment could go up. You could hire a new supervisor at a fixed salary. Those sorts of things would cause the fixed overhead to increase. And the other component of that variance is something called a production volume variance. And the idea of the production volume variance is it gives us a little peek into the capacity of a manufacturing organization and how well we're utilizing that capacity. And so we're going to look at the budgeted fixed overhead. Okay, so that budgeted fixed, when I say budgeted fixed overhead, that's not detailed enough. We have a static and a flexible budget. We're going to take the actual static budget and we're going to compare that to the fixed overhead that would be allocated, I got a spelling error there, allocated for actual output units produced. What the heck does that mean? So that's the flexible budget amount. And how did I get that number? Well, we up here budgeted $240 for every of the fixed overhead for every 1 hour of plasma cutting, and we know that each quarter panel we produce takes 1.5 hours of plasma cutting. So you take the 4,800 actual times the 1.5 hours times the $240, and so that's how you get this number right here, this 1,728,000. So you simply subtract the two. You take the 1.8 million and you subtract from that the 1.728 million, and that's an unfavorable variance. And so the rationale for why that is an unfavorable variance is because when we applied overhead here, we only applied 1.728 million. We didn't allocate enough overhead to cover what we had budgeted for, and the only way that happens is because we didn't use enough hours. So in other words, we only made 4,800 quarter panels when we thought we were going to sell 5,000. So we sold less, so therefore we allocated less of our fixed factory overhead, and that's not favorable. It means we had some machines probably sitting idle, and that's one explanation for this sort of an unfavorable variance, is you didn't have enough product to run through your manufacturing plant to absorb all the overhead that you had anticipated you would absorb. Additionally, it might not be a sales problem, it might be a problem with your maintenance. The machines broke down unexpectedly, and so they sat there idle and you weren't able to produce enough product. So maybe there was enough demand to sell 5,000, but you couldn't produce them because your maintenance program allowed one of your main machines to break down. So between the two of these, if you were to add both of these together, this 32,200 and the 72 grand, you can see that that is your total unfavorable fixed factory overhead amount. But we've been able to dissect that down into two additional variances when we dug a little bit deeper. You have the amount you can attribute to spending more for whatever reason, so that could allow a very different path of investigation as to why that happened, or the production volume variance. So we sold less, we have more capacity than we need, who knows, there's lots of explanations. So that brings us to the end of this second requirement. And actually the third requirement of the problem is to give two examples for each of the variances that are listed, and I've been doing that throughout this problem with the commentary I've been providing. So I'm not going to provide you another video to go through the third requirement.